Hi there. Today I thought we would talk about scones. So for those of you that follow me on Instagram or Facebook, you might remember that a couple of summers ago I became, well, to put it quite honestly, obsessed with scones. Why do I love scones so much? First of all, they're very easy to bake. They come in all sorts of flavors. And for the most part, many of them don't have a high sugar content. So they're a nice compromise, say from a cookie or a piece of cake. Today, I'm actually going to be baking two different recipes of scones. The first one in this video is going to be a very popular one amongst my friends, and that is the lemon scone. And if you don't have lemons, you can actually use this same recipe with oranges instead. That makes a very nice scone. And then later on, I'm going to make a scone recipe that's quite popular with kids as well as adults. And it doesn't take any eggs, so that's wonderful for someone who might have an egg allergy like Madame Fox's little girl. And that's a mini chocolate chip scone, so that will be later. All right, so lemon scones. What do we need? Well, we need some lemons. I've got some flour, some sugar, baking powder, baking soda, some salt, some sour cream, 1 egg, and I've got a half a cup of frozen butter. And we'll talk about that in a moment, but you really want it frozen. And then of course, I have 2 sizes of bowls, small and large. I have a sharp knife. I have a fork, a knife, a half a cup, a third a cup, 1 full cup, and then I have a teaspoon, a quarter of a teaspoon, a tablespoon, and then I've got a lemon zester, a grater, and I have my lemon squeezer, if you have one of those. So I think I have everything. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to preheat our ovens to 400 degrees. Scones are baked for a shorter amount of time with a higher heat. And then back here I have my stone or your baking sheet prepared with parchment paper, so we're all ready to go. So with this recipe, I like to do some prep work to begin. That way I don't have to stop when I'm ready for this. And the very first bit of prep work that I want to do is I want to zest my lemon. Now, I like a good amount of lemon. And so the recipe calls for the zest of 1 large or 2 smaller oranges if you're doing oranges. And then I look at the size of my lemon, and my lemons aren't that large, and so I'm going to zest both of them just to make sure that I have a good amount of lemon. So what is zesting? If you don't have an actual zester like this, you can use any kind of grater that has the small little grates, because you just simply want to take the skin. And by the way, as you know, I've cleaned down all my surfaces, but I've also cleaned my lemons with the virus that's going around. We want to make sure that our food is safe. And so I actually washed my lemon and dried it really well, just to make sure that nothing came home from the grocery store. And of course, I washed my hands. So I want to get the peeling. So the zest is within the peeling. And so what I want to do is I want to grate the skin of my lemon, and that's the zest. And that's where the real tart and lemon and delicious taste is going to come from. And I just realized I forgot my plate. So I'm gonna go get a plate. All right, so I have my plate. I'm going to take my grater or my lemon zester, and I'm simply going to scrape or glide. And so what I've done is I've taken the top part of the peeling, and so when you get down to the white portion, then you know you've got that zested. And so I'm just going to go around my whole lemon and get the zest. And so you'll see in just a moment, I've done that much of my lemon, and I'm going to hold up my plate. That's all the zest that I have off of it. So that's why I've chosen to zest 2 lemons for this recipe. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to finish zesting my lemons, and I'll be back in a moment to show you how much I got from the 2 lemons. All right, so I've zested my 2 lemons, which are still here. I'm going to use those in a bit, and that's the amount of zest that I took from the 2 lemons. So I'm going to just set that aside for a moment. Now I'm going to take my sharp knife, and I want to squeeze the lemons and get as much juice out of the lemons as possible, because I'm going to use the juice, the lemon juice, in the glaze that's going to go on top of the scones after they are baked. If you don't have some kind of a lemon juicer or something like this, you can just slice your lemon in half and squeeze it with your hands over a bowl, and it's going to do the same thing. So I'm just going to squeeze my lemons as much as I can. And I like this because it prevents the pulp and the seeds from going into my juice. And once again, if you haven't noticed, I'm a very big fan of Pampered Chef, and so I got this for Christmas from my children from Pampered Chef. So I'm just about done squeezing the lemons, and I'm going to set the juice aside. Even though I don't need it until my glaze, it's nice to get that prep work done and out of the way, and then I don't have to worry about it. Okay, and I'm going to clean up my work surface. All right, the next little bit of prep work that I want to do for this recipe is I want to take my smaller bowl, and I'm going to take my 1/3 cup, and I'm going to get 1/3 cup of sugar. So that's all of the sugar that's in this scone recipe, which compared to cookies or a cake isn't really bad. So there's my complete full 1/3 cup of sugar. So I'm going to put it in my bowl. Then I'm going to take the lemon zest, and I'm going to leave just a little tiny bit on my plate, but I'm going to put the majority of it in the sugar. My hands are clean, so I'm just going to use my fingers to slide that zest into the sugar, and I'm going to just leave a little smidgen on the plate, and I'm going to set that aside because I'm going to use that for a little bit of extra zing on top of the glaze when I glaze them. So now I'm going to take my fork, and I'm going to blend the zest and the sugar together so that it creates, and it smells so good. And those of you that choose to do this with orange, that smells really nice as well. So I'll hold this up, and I'm kind of creaming it like I would with the butter and the sugar if I was making cookies. I'm going to cream it with the back of my fork. So that's what I have, this beautiful yellow sugar mixture, and it smells so good. So I'm going to set that aside. That is ready to go in just a moment. Okay, I'm now going to take my bigger bowl, and now I'm going to get my dry ingredients for my scones ready. So this recipe calls for 2 cups. So I keep reminding my students to take your knife, and I'm going to overfill my flour, my cup, and I'm with my flat edge. I want to tap that flour out, get rid of any air pockets, and I'm going to dump it in my bowl like that. That's 1 cup. And here is my 2nd cup. Okay. Cover that up. Next, the recipe calls for 1 teaspoon of baking powder. So I'm almost out of baking powder, but I had a friend rescue me the other day and brought me some from the store. Thank you. And there is my complete teaspoon of baking powder. So I'm going to pop that in. Then the recipe calls for 1/4 of a teaspoon of baking soda. Just a smidgen of baking soda. So there's my baking soda. And then it calls for 1/2 of a teaspoon of salt. So I am just going to do what I normally do. I could measure it, but I'm going to 1/2 teaspoon is kind of like a nice dash. So there I go, there's my salt. That goes into the bowl. Now I'm going to take my fork that has the sugar and the lemon zest on it. I don't need to clean it off. And I'm going to incorporate all of those dry ingredients. The reason why I don't need to clean that off is because the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my lemon sugar and I'm going to add that. And I'm going to set that aside because I'm going to use that bowl again here in a moment. And I'm going to take my fork and I want to make sure that my flour and sugar mixture is really well mixed and incorporated. Okay. Now, with scones, there's a couple of little secrets when we're baking scones. And one of the secrets that I have learned is that you want your butter frozen. So if you go back to the video that we talked about butter and how we cut and measure butter, I have already pre-cut my butter so that it's 1/2 cup. And this morning I popped it into the freezer. And we want to break this butter up into little pieces into our flour. So how do we do that? And why do we freeze it? The reason for freezing it is that when the scones are baking in the oven, the frozen butter will release a certain amount of moisture into the dough, which, because we want our scones to be kind of crusty on the outside and then very soft and just decadent to eat on the inside. And frozen butter helps to create that. And pretty hard to chop up frozen butter. So you're going to take your grater and you're going to grate it right over your bowl. And it's a little bit of an arm workout depending on how hard your butter is, and hopefully it's quite frozen. And takes a little bit of time, but it really will make the recipe. So I'm going to continue grating the butter, and I will be back in a moment when it's done. So I finished grating my frozen butter, and there you see it. I have my fork, and I'm going to mix the flour and the frozen grated butter together. And I want to, I don't want to work it too much because I don't want the butter to get too soft. I want to just simply, with my fork, mix that until I can tell that every piece of butter is coated and it's fairly evenly distributed amongst the flour sugar mixture. And so it looks like little grains. You can see little chunks of butter. All right, so I'm going to set that aside for a moment. And then I'm going to take the bowl that my sugared lemon zest was in. And I'm going to put 1 egg. I'm going to crack an egg. Watch for shells, remember? So I'm going to put my egg in that. And then I'm going to take my sour cream and my 1/2 cup, and I'm going to fill. And you really want, this is going to be the moisture or liquid for your scone. So you want to fill that right to the brim. And this is almost out, so I'm gonna hold it up like that. If you measure just a little bit more, that's not a big deal. My container is pretty much clean, so I'm just going to kind of empty it out into here. And then I'm going to put my half a cup of sour cream. And I think for this, I just happen to have whatever I had in the fridge. You can use low fat if you want. This was 14%. So whatever you wish to use. And I want to make sure I get all of my sour cream, so I'm going to take my spatula and clean that half a cup out as much as possible. So I'm going to set that aside. So now I'm going to stir my egg and my sour cream really well. And so you've got a nice yellow, pretty yellow mixture. You could do this with a fork, spoon, whisk, however you wish. The main thing is to really blend it well, and then we want to get every last little drop into our scone, dry scone mixture. Okay, so now I'm going to take my flour, I'm going to take my spatula, and I'm going to empty and pour the sour cream and the egg into my flour, scraping out every last little bit of liquid as possible. Oh, almost dropped it. Okay, I think I've got it all. All right, so now comes another tip. Just like the frozen butter tip, we do not want to overwork scones. So with my fork still, I'm going to fold over. So I'm not like stirring like this. Folding is just kind of a motion where I go from one side of the bowl to the other side, flipping it over, making sure that my wet and my dry ingredients are starting to come together. When we overmix, so a lot of the recipes that I've shown you, I would say that normally I would do it in my mixer, but today I'm doing old school. I never do scones in my mixer because that really adds to the possibility of overmixing. And when you overmix your scone, then you lose the texture of a scone and it becomes more like a cake texture, and we don't want that, right? Scone is a scone, cake is cake. So I'm going to simply mix this until it is like that. See how it's starting to come together, but it's still very quite dry looking. And now I'm going to turn it over onto my clean surface. So I'm going to clean up my area, and I will show you what the next step looks like. Be right back. All right, so I've cleaned my area all up, and I have my scone dough, and I'm going to dump, careful not to do like I just did and almost spill it on the floor. I'm going to empty all of the contents out onto my clean work surface. Try to get as much off of the fork as possible. Just set that aside. Okay, so clearly I need to create a more uniform dough to this. So I'm going to use the term kneading, but if you remember from the cinnamon buns, we kneaded that dough for 10 whole minutes. That is not what we want to do. We want to try and not overwork the dough, but we need to get the dough into a decent shape, a decent ball. So I'm going to just, with my clean hands, I'm going to bring the dough together, and I'm going to, taking my kneading movement, and I'm basically going to count it out so you can see how little. So that was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, it's kind of like 12, 13, 14. It's kind of sticking to my hands, so that's okay. Okay, so I lost count, but it was under 20 times that I handled the dough. And so you might be thinking, and when you're doing this at home, it still looks quite dry. It's not smooth, and that's what we want. We don't want our dough to be overworked. So when I first started making scones, I would simply make this lump of dough into a nice round disc and create 8 large scones. Then I started finding that scone, for those of us that want a treat but we don't want to overindulge, that was a little too big. And so I decided I started making more of a mini scone. So that's what I'm going to do today. You can opt for the larger scone if you want. So I'm going to take this and I'm just going to, as best as I can, divide it in half. And so I have 2 now clumps of dough. So the first clump I want to flatten out with my hands and have a nice, as fairly round as possible. One of the lovely things that I enjoy about a scone is that not one scone is exactly like the other. They're kind of a rough looking shape. And that's how I think scones should look, versus say a cupcake is, you know, all the cupcakes are fairly the same, uniform, and to a certain extent even cookies. Okay, so now I'm going to take my second dough and I want to try to get it, you know, roughly the same size. And so there I have my two scone discs. So when I try to, they're about that size. I can't quite put my fingers together. Now I'm going to take my pizza cutter and I'm simply going to cut one disc right down the middle in half and then crossways. So now I have 4 pieces, and then do that again to create 8 mini scones. And then I'll do the same thing with this one over here, and half, and then crossways, and then half. So I'm going to clean up my hands and I'm going to position the camera right over so you can see exactly how I cut them. Be right back. So as you can see, there are my 2 round discs of scone dough, and they are each cut into 8 small little scones. So now it's time to get them onto my baking sheet. One of the other reasons why I really enjoy making scones is if I'm at this stage and I think that's 16 little scones that I have that's going to be out of the oven here in just a moment, and I think there's no way I can eat those scones before they go bad, because a scone you want to have, I believe in fresh baked goods, I wouldn't want to keep them any more than a couple of days, but I know some people would disagree with me, but I'm a little fussy about my baked goods. So at this stage, I could take some saran wrap and I could freeze all of these right now, and they could stay in the freezer for up to 3 weeks. And if I woke up one morning and thought I would like a couple of scones, I could take them out 2, 3, 4 at a time and bake them just as is. Kind of a pain because you'd be making glaze all the time, or you might choose not to glaze them. But that's the really great thing. They can literally go from the freezer to the oven. And if I'm taking them to school for a meeting or for a treat, I will do this everything the night before, and then I will pop them either into the fridge or the freezer, and I bake them fresh that morning of the meeting versus baking them the night before, because I love fresh baked goods. So I'm going to take my little spatula here. I like to use this little spreader. And I'm simply, because I'm going to bake them all up today, I'm going to put them on my baking. So I've got my scones on my baking stone, and I chose to actually divide them into 2 separate baking sheets, because you don't want your scones to be close together because they're going to expand while they're baking, and I want them to bake as an individual. I don't want them to kind of bump up against one another or expand into the other one. So I'm going to put them in my preheated oven at 400 degrees, and I'm going to set my timer for 15 minutes. There. So I'm going to clean up my surface, and while they are baking, I'm going to show you how to make the glaze. Now it's time for the yummy glaze. Most of my scone recipes have some sort of glaze or topping, and you don't have to do this, but I think you're missing out if you don't indulge just a little bit. All right, for this glaze, you're going to need 1 cup of icing sugar. So I think I mentioned when we were making the cinnamon buns that I hate measuring icing sugar. And if this were just me and I wasn't filming it, I'd probably just dump some icing sugar in, but because I took the lazy route when I made the cinnamon buns, but I'm gonna measure it just for you guys. Okay, just gets all over my hands. All right. So I don't bother scraping it off like I do the flour, because if there's a couple of air pockets or if I have a little bit too much, that's not a big deal. So there is, it's flying all over. See, I don't like the mess. Okay, but I'll deal with it. All right, so there's my cup of icing sugar. Next, the recipe calls for 3 tablespoons of melted butter. So I already have my butter melted, and I use my wax paper. You know I'm a lover of wax paper. Keeps the splatters to a minimum. So there's 1 teaspoon of butter, 3 tablespoons of butter, and there's the 3rd tablespoon of butter. So just so you know, I melted not quite a 1/4 cup of butter, and I just have a little bit of butter left over. Okay, so there is I'm going to use that tablespoon here in a moment. Oh, butter flying all over. Then I'm going to take, got 6 minutes left on my scones. Then I'm going to take a 1/2 teaspoon of vanilla. So remember, I don't want you to measure the vanilla over your bowl. I didn't spill it. Yay me. And there's 1/2 teaspoon of vanilla. And then before I start mixing this all up, I'm going to, I have my lemon juice that I previously squeezed, and I'm going to take 1 tablespoon at a time. So there's 1 tablespoon of lemon juice. I might end up adding a little bit more. So I'm going to stir this up. Go slowly at first. You don't want the icing sugar to kind of fly up into your face and get all over your counter. So you want this to be runny. You want this a glaze. So right now, with the measurements that I have used, I have like a frosting, and that's way, way too thick. So I'm going to add another tablespoon of the lemon juice. And then I'm going to carefully and slowly at first stir that up. And like I said, you could do this with oranges as well. And so what I notice immediately, that it is runny and it's starting to get really smooth. So the more that you stir this, because you want a nice smooth glaze. And so that is what I have right now. And I might just add a little smidgen, is that a word? Smidgen? A little smidgen of lemon juice. And I think that is it. So that is what I have. And that is the consistency. So when the scones come out of the oven and they've had a chance to cool, I'm going to drizzle that glaze over top of the scones, and they are going to be so yummy. See you in a bit. Okay, so my scones are now out of the oven. I just took them out and my kitchen smells really, really good. Unlike cookies that I would leave on my pan to settle, I want to remove these from the stone because I don't want them to bake anymore. I don't want the bottoms to get really, really too dark. So if you can kind of tell, the top of my scone, you can see how it's nicely raised and it's slightly golden. And then if I can lift this up without burning myself, you'll see the bottom nice and brown. So that's what you want a scone to look like. You want it to be golden and a little bit crusty on top, but when you bite into it, it's going to be nice and soft. And with a cup of tea, it's going to be yummy. So I'm going to finish getting these onto my rack, my cooling rack, and then I'm going to let them set for about 15 minutes because I don't want to glaze them when they're super, super hot. I don't want the glaze to just kind of disintegrate and totally melt. I want the glaze to not only taste good, but I want it to be pretty. So I will be back and I will show you the last and final step of these delicious scones. See you in a bit. So my scones have cooled about 15 minutes. I have my glaze, and you might want to have to really kind of mix up your glaze quite a bit if it has set for a bit and hardened a little bit like mine did. And actually, I'm going to add just a little bit more because when it sits for a while, it has a tendency to harden. So I'm going to add a little bit more lemon juice because I saved it. I didn't throw out my lemon juice. I'm actually going to add it to some nice cold water and drink after. And I tried to angle the camera so that you could see underneath my cooling rack, I laid a piece of wax paper on my countertop. And you're going to find out exactly why I did that in just a moment. So I'm going to take a nice big spoonful of my glaze and I'm just going to drizzle it over in kind of like a zigzag motion. There's really no precise way to do this. Some people might put it in a piping bag maybe and have a little bit more uniform drizzle. I don't worry about that too much. I kind of like how every scone is a little bit of a different shape and has a little bit different of a pattern of glaze on it. And you can see that the glaze is kind of coming down over the sides of the scones, which makes it really pretty, or hopefully you can see that from the video. And notice that the glaze is falling through my cooling rack, I guess, baking rack, onto the wax paper. So that's going to make my cleanup a lot easier than if it was just on my bare countertop. Because remember, This is full of butter and sugar and all kinds of goodness. All right, so I left a little bit in my bowl. I didn't use it all. Then I'm going to take the little smidgen of lemon zest, and I don't always do this, but I like to just sprinkle some of the lemon zest on top of the scones before the icing, the glaze, excuse me, has a chance to set. Oh, some just fell on my wax paper. And it adds a little bit of zing, but it also makes them really nice and pretty, I find. I don't always do it. When I remember to do it, I do it. And I remembered today. So there you have it. That is a yummy treat to have if you want a little cup of tea in the afternoon, or if you want a special little treat for breakfast. And they're not that hard to make, and they can be, remember, frozen in the dough stage, and then you can pop them into the oven right from the freezer as you want to bake them. So I'm going to let these set and let the icing kind of harden before I put them in a container, but these are really meant to eat right away. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I've got another one coming up with chocolate chips and no eggs. I want to commend all of MCS students for continuing to practicing social distancing and self-isolation. It's hopefully helping, as they say, to not only flatten or plank that curve, but please know that every single staff member at MCS misses you all very, very much. So until I see you next time, bye-bye.